Good day, everyone. For the continuation of our discussion, let's now move forward to the chapter 2, the principles of learning in psychology. So this is the topic that was being assigned to me. I am Genevieve L. Day-oman, your reporter for today. Before we proceed to our final discussion about the principles of learning in psychology, let's discuss first the learning outcomes of the lesson. So at the end of the discussion, students will be able to understand and apply the learning principles and its different types. Students will be able to design, conduct, and evaluate research that address questions relevant to forensic social science. And lastly, the learner should be able to demonstrate skills in communication, ethical behavior, complex cognitive process relevant to the field of psychology. So in psychology of learning, if there is the principles of learning, we must also remember the characteristics of learning. So we must discuss first these characteristics of learning before we go on to our final and the most important topic that we need to tackle for today. So in characteristics of learning, learning involves change. All learning involves activities. Learning requires interactions, constitute learning, and learning is a lifelong process. Also, learning occurs randomly throughout life. Then, learning involves problem solving. Learning is the process of acquiring information. Learning involves far more than thinking. And lastly, experience is necessary for learning. So it is very understandable, and characteristics of learning has its big rules, and learning has its big impact in our daily life. Okay, now let's discuss about what is psychology of learning. So, according to my research, psychology of learning is a theoretical science that covers the various psychological theories that relate with learning. Throughout history, there has been many various psychological learning theories. Some take on a more behaviorist approach, which focuses on inputs and reinforcements. Psychology of learning also refers to broadly to theory and research derived from different types of learning, including classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning or modeling. Applied behavior analysis draws primarily on operant conditioning as the basis of developing interventions. So that is what psychology of learning is. So it is about a theoretical science that covers the various psychological theories that relate with learning. So it's about theoretical, it's about theories which is include or relate about learning. Psychology of learning in education. Educational psychology is the study of how people learn, including teaching methods, instructional processes, and individual differences in learning. The goal is to understand how people learn and retain information. So psychology of learning in education, it is a very important part, especially in students' life, in which psychology or this learning can help students learn and retain information. So it has a big role in education. Psychology has a big role in education. Psychology of learning in education example. If a student forgets to study for a test and receive a poor grade as a result, they are likely to remember to study the next time they have a test, because their forgetfulness to study decreases if they experience positive punishment. So, psychology is about the mentality or about the behavior of a student. So, In this example, it is a very good example in a student's life, especially when a student or the student is given a test and then they don't remember the answer. So the next time they are going to have a test, they are making sure that they can answer and remember those discussion they have in class. So that this their learnings will retain and they will not forget the next time they are going to have a test. As we all know, there are many psychologists who study about psychology in learning, and one of them is Edward Lee Thorndike. Edward Lee Thorndike is an American psychologist considered as the father of educational psychology. He was devoted throughout his career to understanding the process of learning. His interest in and contribution to our understanding of learning range from studies with animals, children, and eventually with adults. So Edward Lee Thorndike has a big contribution about our learning or about educational psychology in our history as well as now in the present. According to Edward Lee Thorndike, or Thorndike's principle, suggests that responses immediately followed by satisfaction will be more likely to recur. The law of effect also suggests that behaviors followed by dissatisfaction or discomfort will become less likely to occur. So it is according to Thorndike's principle. Now let's move forward to the different types of learning in psychology, and it is according to my research. So there are 4 types of learning psychology that I have put in here or I've chosen. These are behavioral learning theory, cognitive learning theory, constructivist learning theory, and lastly, inquiry-based learning theory. Psychologists have come up with many different theories to explain what actually happens when someone learns something. And these are the behavioral learning theory, the cognitive learning theory, the constructivist learning theory, and the inquiry-based learning theory. These are the 4 ways of analyzing the learning process that have impacted teaching strategies, clinical treatment, and parenting advice. Many learning theories are not mutually exclusive. Behavioral learning theory. In behavioral learning theory, learning is based on outside stimuli. The learner is seen as an empty vessel who will learn based on the teacher's use of positive and negative incentives, responses, punishments, and rewards. A teacher using a system of grade point deductions for undone homework or rewarding prepared students with praise or extra free time, or making a contract with a student to modify her performance is using behavioral learning principles. In this paradigm, learning has taken place if behavior changes. The second one is the cognitive learning theory. In cognitive learning theory, the most important factor in learning is the inner working of a student's brain. Cognitive theorists analyze the development of human intellectual ability, attempting to understand what actually happens in someone's head when he remembers, thinks, or solves problems. In cognitive learning theory, the mind is conceptualized as an information processor rather than a blank state to be filled. A teacher using songs or rhymes to help students to memorize facts. In using a cognitive approach, learning is measured by a change in a student's schema or conceptualization of the subject matter. And the third one is the constructivist learning theory. Constructivist theory goes beyond the conception of the learner as neutral information processor to consider what actual data he himself contributes as an active participant. Learning takes place when the learner, combining prior knowledge and experience with the information being offered, takes full ownership by newly constructing the learning in his own brain. The learner is seen as a very active participant, and this experience and background will influence the way new knowledge takes hold. A teacher leading an exploratory discussion of a poem or story is applying constructivist theory. The last type about learning in psychology is the inquiry-based learning theory. In inquiry-based learning theory, the goal is a holistic and nuanced understanding of subject matter reached by solving problems, carrying out projects and experiments. Cognitive and constructive principles as students' processing methods and her prior knowledge and experiment are both considered important. Inquiry-based learning theory emphasizes metacognitive processes, the mental methods as a student develops as she learns the art of learning itself. A teacher using an interdisciplinary approach to a subject that pulls together related art, readings in history, and scientific experimentation around the related theme is applying inquiry-based learning theory. Okay, let's now move forward to the principles of learning in psychology. What is principles of learning? So it is accordance of my research. Principles of learning, also known as laws of learning. It includes readiness, exercise, effect, primacy, recency, intensity, and freedom. Readiness implies a degree of willingness and eagerness of an individual to learn something new. So that is what principles of learning all about. There are 7 principles of learning that I want to share or to discuss with you. So these are learners at the center, social nature of learning, emotions are integral to learning, recognize individual differences, stretch all students, assessment for learning, and lastly, build horizontal connection. So these principles that I have chosen, and it is according to my research also. So I want to clarify and I want to share it with you and to discuss about what I've learned from these principles. So the first one is learners at the center. The learning environment recognizes the learners as its core participants, encourages their active engagement, and develops in them an understanding of their own activity as learners. So this is important principles in psychology of learning, in which we must encourage the active engagement or participation of our students, and the students will develop their understanding in their own understanding about the activity that was given to them or that is given to them, because they are the learners, they are the main core participants in this principle or in psychology of learning. The second one is the social nature of learning. The socio-cultural theory of learning is a school of philosophical thought that embraces the primary of human action, the interaction and involvement of individuals within communities, and the mediational power of technologies. The third principle of psychology in learning is the emotions are integral to learning. In short, learning is dynamic, social, and context-dependent because emotions form a critical piece of how, what, when, and why people think, remember, and learn. So this is very important in principles of psychology in learning. For example, tests, examinations, homework, and deadlines are associated with different emotional states that encompass frustration, anxiety, and boredom. Even subject matter influences emotions that affect one's ability to learn and remember. The fourth principle of learning is recognize individual differences. Individual differences are found in all psychological characteristics, physical, mental abilities, knowledge, habit, personality, and character traits. Perhaps the first task of every teacher in class should be to know and study individual differences among students. So, as a future teachers, we must also study and we must also know the individual differences of our students. The fifth principle of learning is the stretch all students. Both strands are important. Stretching and challenging all learners means creating lessons where challenge is at the forefront of teaching and learning. This takes learners out of their comfort zone, encouraging them to push towards the outer edge of what is possible for them to achieve. And this is very important principles in learning. So we must also help our student or encourage our student to go beyond or go out from their comfort zone, so that in this principle we can be able to challenge our learners and we can help them boost their self-esteem or their self-confidence. Assessment for learners. It is one of the principles of learning in psychology. So assessment for learning, or AFL, is an approach to teaching and learning that creates feedback which is then used to improve students' performance. Students become more involved in the learning process and from this gain confidence in what they are expected to learn and to what standard. And the last principle is the build horizontal connections. Making connections is a critical reading strategy that helps students make meaning of what they're reading. When they make connections to the text that they're reading, it's going to help them make sense of what they're reading, help them retain the information better, and help them engage more with the text itself. Principles are important for the governing of actions and the operation of techniques in any field of education. True principles explain educational processes. They show how things are done and how educational results are achieved. For the individual, a principle, when it is understood and accepted, serves in important ways to guide his reflective thinking and his choice of activities or actions. In the field of education, an accepted principle becomes part of one's philosophy, which serves to determine and evaluate his educational aims, activities, practices, and outcomes. The following are the references for my lesson topic. That would be all for my discussion about the principles of learning in psychology for the chapter 2. Thank you for listening and God bless you.